Hello and welcome to another episode of That 60s Recording Podcast, the podcast that has conversations inspired by the golden era of recording. I hope you've all had a absolutely fantastic week. This week is the second part of my conversation with Nashville recording engineer and producer Ryan Poole, who is also a member of the band Nite Tides. That's spelt Nite, N-I-T-E. This week we focus on my favourite topic ever, which is drum recording. And Ryan, as you found out at the end of the last episode, has a sort of constricted setup. So he's had a really interesting journey to drum recording through working as a sort of assistant at a larger studio and being brought up in the usual manner of lots of mics everywhere to suddenly having to find a way to record using a fairly minimal setup, which is obviously kind of something that I enjoy talking about. So we'll dive straight into this. In fact, before we do, also notice that that Spotify has now introduced some form of review system. So if you're listening to this on Spotify, and you would be so kind to tap the three dots in the sort of wherever it is corner of the podcast and leave a hopefully a favorable review for the podcast. That would really help with listings and all whatever jazz that does help with, but that would be much appreciated. Thank you. So here we go, straight on with part 2 of my conversation with Ryan Poole. I am going to preface this now by saying to everybody who is listening, if we've started this officially now, that me and Ryan are having this conversation for the second time because I made a foolish error of not pushing record on the Zoom meeting, which, considering I'm, 90-odd episodes into into this podcast, you'd think I'd be a little bit more proficient than I am, but apparently not. So we're going to reenact this last part of the conversation, which was I'm actually quite looking forward to, and I think it will be. I think it will be slightly different, but there might be a couple of occasions where it feels as though I'm forcing something that I know has happened from yesterday, or we might go like, as I said yesterday, and it's something that you guys don't know, and it also explains why my voice will suddenly sound like it's being recorded in my kitchen, which it is, as opposed to my studio, which it was yesterday. So thanks for rejoining me, Ryan. I appreciate it.
No problem, Joe.
So we ended on drums. We were going to talk about drums, and I want to know again about your drum mic setup and the way that you, sort of the approach that you've got towards drum miking in your studio.
Yeah. So drums for me, I came up in a studio in San Diego called Studio West as an intern, and then went to school at the Art Institute. And so I learned drums the modern way. And, that's a kick in, kick out, snare top bottom, direct mics on all the toms, stereo overhead, and stereo rooms. And, maybe if you're being clever, a mono smash mic or whatever, everybody calls it a different thing, or a knee mic. And that was kind of the extent of creativity was, do you have a mono mic and what will you do with it?
Yep.
And so for the longest time, that's how I did drums. And then I found myself in the current studio I'm in, and I was limited in every way, but especially by microphones and preamps. So when I first got this space, I just had the UAD Apollo, and I thought I would never record drums here. Like I would only do overdubs and mixes, and that I would always do my drums at major commercial studios. And then I had a client come in who wanted drums, and they didn't tell me in advance. They just showed up with a drummer. And so we did, I was not prepared at all. And so I think I did like one overhead and a snare mic and a kick mic. And I think that was as many channels as I could spare. And
they were happy with this. They didn't have any interest in going anywhere else to do it.
Yeah. Well, also what they were doing was more for like a live video performance thing.
Okay.
And so in the end, I don't even think they would have noticed. And I triggered the snare to kind of help that out a bit. But
sorry, I'm going to pause you 1 second. Aria, you really need to stop singing. Or you're going to have to go up to bed or go into the living room if you want to. You can have the telly on in the living room, darling, but you can't have anything on in here. Where's your iPad? Right, would you like to take my phone and watch YouTube on my phone? Right, but you need to go into the other room. Yeah. All right, you can't be in this room. And can you shut the door, please? She's just trumpeting with loud mouth going. Yes, thank you. Kids have this kind of I don't know what it is. It's like a switch when you're either on FaceTime or Zoom or something, and you can have the most serious discussion beforehand, and they still just don't listen. As soon as that conversation starts, it's like they just go on to. Even then, when I was telling her off, she's just smiling away at me as if like, I know, I'm annoying. So anyway, we were talking about. So it was a live recording, so it's very, must have been slightly less pressure than if it was going to be a record, I suppose.
Right. There wasn't a lot of pressure to make this anything special. And anyhow, when I got to the end of it, I was like, the drums really don't sound that bad with a mono overhead and a kick and a snare. Like it worked for the situation. And so then I had a client come in and they wanted to do drums, and I was like, cool. Well, so we should go to a major studio, and it's going to be, $600 to $1,000 for the day, and that's the best way to record drums, And like, can we do it at your place for free? And I was like, well, maybe. And so I, had heard of the Glenn Johns technique, and so I watched a bunch of YouTube videos. I was like, all right, 4 mics, this can be done. And by that time, I had gotten this Alltech 1220 console I use. So now I'm up to, 8 inputs at a time. So I'm like, okay, with 8 inputs, I could do the Glenn Johns and have room for talkback and guitar and everything else. So did the Glenn Johns technique. I had to borrow some microphones to pull it off. And then when I actually got to mixing the track, I realized that the drums sounded super cool. And they sounded vintage, but that's what we were going for. And I realized so many things that I've been told or heard over the years about, maybe the doing 12 mics on a drum kit might be overkill, and that actually sometimes the sound sounds better when you don't have so many mics and so many phase problems. Exactly. But I think it's hard when you have the options to not use them, and when you go to a commercial studio and you have all of these great mics and all these great preamps and compressors, it's like, we're paying for this stuff. Like, let's use every single one of them. But it's only when I got into my own space where I just don't have the budget to be able to have all those things that I out of necessity stripped back to 4 mics and realized, well, actually, you know what? I hardly ever use a hi-hat mic. Like, and if I do, it's not very much. And you get a lot of hi-hat in the rooms. And actually, if you think about it, overheads are also room mics, particularly if you put them far enough.
Yes.
Or by that, I mean that you get room on it. It's just the room mics get more room.
Yeah.
And so, and since then I've realized if you throw those mics into Omni, you get even more room on them, if you pull them back further. So these limitations caused me to do techniques that otherwise, like, I'm prone to excess. I would love to do all of the microphones, but out of necessity, I've stripped back and found that there's actually a lot of validity to that. And then since then, I've started adding some of the mics back, but every time I add a mic back, now it's for a reason.
Yeah, that's really important way of thinking about it. And I'm listening to, I'm kind of picturing my studio. I had a bit of a rewire, I suppose you'd call it. And that makes it sound like it's more sort of technical than it actually was. Just it was unplugging stuff and putting it in different places. And I've got a 1073, one of the AML, the Audio Maintenance Limited 1073s, that's not being used currently, and an 1176 that's not being used. Just because in the current setup I have,
Send it to me.
There was just nothing that I wanted it to be on, and
Yeah.
in that moment in time, I was just like, oh, I could put it on that, but I just sort of don't really want to. And now they're in the patch bay, but they're not patched in, and it's exactly that thing, you know. Part of me was like, oh, well, maybe I should just put it on that because then it's being used, and I was like, well, why not? You know, it's going in my Alice pre's. They sound great. Why would I change it up for the sake of it? It was but I know that feeling of, like, you know, all of the options, so you've got to use them all.
Yeah, that's great restraint you're showing not to use the 1176.
Well, in its defense or my defense, it's just one of the warm audio ones. It's not a serious Universal Audio 1176. I would,
Gotcha.
I'd remortgage my house for one of those, but my wife wouldn't let me. I'm kind of curious. We didn't actually speak about this yesterday, but I'm interested in what it was like interning at a studio, because that's not an opportunity that many people get to have these days. It's I've spoken to a few producers for the podcast who have, and I think it's quite an important thing. You know, I've had one or two people come to my my studio and look at the way I do things and observe that. And I think that's kind of a really important thing for younger, 20-somethings to be doing, or late teens to be doing, as opposed to just watching YouTube videos. What was that like for you?
You know, it's one of those things that I think at the time mostly felt boring. But it also felt incredibly exciting. I think after doing it for 8 months, I got to the point where I was like, all right, I kind of want to move on now. But it was such a juxtaposition of things, because in one sense it's like, oh, some cool artist is in today. I know one time they had Noah and the Whale.
Oh,
if
yeah.
you've heard of them.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
They were big at the time, and I was like, oh, an artist who's big is here. How, that was really exciting. And I got to like meet them and, set up a microphone. And so that felt very important and exciting. But most days what you do is, at the studio I was at, it's like you come in and you have a list of cleaning responsibilities, and you're going to spend about 2 hours to take care of all those things. And then any time after that is just sort of, now that's what you've done your cleaning to earn. And sometimes that was great, because sometimes there's an engineer there who is willing to let you come in and help them set up, and you got to see how they mic'd a guitar cabinet or drums or whatever. Maybe you even got to run cables or do something, and learn. But a lot of times, sessions were closed, or just they weren't interested in that, or they had done the setup the day before, and then you're just hanging out in the lobby waiting to be helpful to somebody who needs to know where the soda machine is. And so I think this almost is like a principle for young people, I think, in general. It's like the thing that you really want to do in life, it's just not going to happen for you overnight, and it's not going to be as glamorous and as quick as you really wish it was going to happen. But all of these experiences that you can have in your formative years end up being helpful down the line, and you don't know how they're going to be helpful, but they and you don't know what's the important stuff at the time, but in hindsight it's great. So when I got my own recording studio, I had been taught how to clean a studio and make it presentable for clients, and how to make the sodas look nice in the refrigerator, things like that. And so when I got my own studio, it was a lot smaller than the place I'm in now. I remember, cleaning it up each day and trying to make it as nice as I could, even though it was it was tiny. It was 20 feet by 9 feet, or 18 feet by 9 feet.
Yeah.
But I when I was sweeping it, I would think, I'm training right now to have something bigger and better in the future. And if I can take care of this small space and do a good job of it, that's going to prepare me for when I have something bigger. So my current studio is like 2,000 square feet, and and the same things apply. I was sweeping up last night, and no matter how old you get, you're probably still going to have to sweep up. And that's not the only thing I learned, but,
But I understand what you're saying, and I think that that's really interesting. And going from studios that I remember being in when I was sort of a young teenager, or like mid to late teens, starting out in bands, and either be it rehearsal studios, and then you go into make EPs or singles or whatever we were doing back then. And you go to these studios that are grubby and they're just not maintained. And I grew up thinking that was almost an acceptable, like studios are supposed to be dirty and messy, and that's what they have to be. And my dad will be listening to this, and I had a funny conversation with him when he came up to my place the first time, and he was like, "Oh, it's it's really, really clean and tidy." And it's like, well, yeah, of course it is. I work here every day. Like, what did you think it was going to be? I'm a clean and tidy person. It's not going to be anything else. And it's that sort of mentality to make it a comfortable environment to be in. I'm constantly thinking in exactly that same way, looking around my space. I've just been out today and bought some lampshades because a couple of the lights, I was like, it's after our conversation yesterday. I was like, it needs to look a bit better. So, every time one of those little situations occurs, you have to sort it. And I think that you get that by seeing a commercial studio.
Right.
I've seen it in the times that I've been down to, the bigger commercial studios, in London mainly, they all operate on that exact same level. And I think another big part of it, especially this is something I got from Abbey Road the few times that I've been down there, is how organized they are for sessions. They fill out a session sheet the day before every session. They know every microphone that's being checked into that session, and even if it's the simplest session ever, they're pre-planning in their mind what's not even in their mind. They're pre-planning on paper what needs to be delivered for that session. And I like that organized approach to it. The times I've had artists in where where I've not really thought about it and I've winged it, I've been sweating. And that's not a nice position to be in at all. And I suppose that's probably, I would assume that's something that you must have picked up from your internship, that just whether you're aware of it or not, all of those little nuances that make a studio appear professional, as opposed to just sort of haphazard.
Yeah, and then you take what works for you and leave behind what you don't need. And I think it was good for me to see, to fill out a session sheet and see that level of organization. I don't personally do that because for the types of things I do, it's not yet proved to be necessary. But I know what it is, and I've seen it in play. And if I ever come to the point where that's going to be helpful, now I know that there is a tool, but of course it's not all just cleaning and the things you learn. Like I probably learned a lot about how do you mic drums from just seeing the engineers at this studio do it, and didn't even realize how much I was learning at the time. Because a lot of times we have this idea that learning needs to happen. Somebody needs to sit you down. And I think I felt that way. Like, no one's ever teaching me anything, Someone needs to sit you down and explain it. But you actually learn a lot by seeing it. And then getting your little question in here or there. But it also gives you a huge appreciation when you actually do have your own studio and you're doing your own things to have worked through the ranks. I wanted, personally, as I think a lot of engineers do, I wanted to be an intern, and then they up me to a gopher, and then they up me to be an assistant engineer, and that was the traditional path, and I was taught that path, and I was hoping that would work for me. But that is it's a much rarer path today than it used to be, mostly because there's not a lot of staff positions available. And so when I moved to Nashville, I became a gopher at a studio. Which was a really exciting experience because in Nashville, there's we constantly had celebrities in and out, and top level engineers. So it was very exciting to be around. I learned a lot, but I was again hoping for that staff engineer position to come up. And what I learned is those do come up, but it happens every like 3 to 5 years or something. And if you're just don't happen to be there at the time when that position comes available, like, do you really want to be a $10 an hour gopher for 3 years waiting to ever get your shot to engineer?
Yeah,
And that's where you have to just decide to go out and freelance and make it happen for yourself.
I think that's it's completely sensible. And I mean, I'm up in the north of England, and that's not that doesn't exist here. I mean, I can imagine that exists in Nashville's obviously a huge music town.
That classic path, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and there are commercial studios up here, but they certainly don't have a raft of staff engineers, and the only real way to do it is to sort of go it alone, which is why it's so. And I think that's quite common, outside of the major music cities, London, Nashville, and all those sorts of places. It's becoming less and less common that people get the opportunity to have an internship. So I think, from that perspective, you're quite fortunate to have had one. But then what's nice about it is it's almost taught you what you going by where you're at now. I'm talking specifically about drums now. I've switched. My mind's flicked to drums without even telling anybody.
As it must.
You're almost. You've almost seen the excess of drum mics and gone, okay, that's one way of doing things, and then got sort of put in a position where you had to do it another way and found out that way could work for you.
Yeah, it's funny because I learned the way what to do when you have everything. And so that's what I always wanted to do. And I used to just feel like I needed to have everything. And until I did, I needed to go to somebody else's studio. And then it's only because I got pushed into the position to need to do it another way that I did. And then having done that, now I've learned that there's actually a lot of validity. So where I'm at now with drums, my current phase is I'm kind of just in constant experimentation land. So I have very few microphones here at the studio, an embarrassingly small amount of microphones for being a professional engineer. But my creativity is no longer in choosing what mic I can use, because I'm going to use them all. It's which one goes on what and where do you put it?
Yeah.
And you realize that there's actually so many things you can do with that. So a lot of times for Nite Tides, I've almost always done a mono overhead with the D19.
Nice.
And then I have the D112 for kick. Would love if that was a D12 instead, but it's not. And so
I've heard interesting things about the D12s. Apparently they break quite regularly, and once they're done, they're done. And the people that I've spoken to, I've kind of gone, I'd love to try a D12 out, and everyone goes, I don't know. So
really?
I've avoided them a little bit because they're quite pricey given the sort of heritage of them. But
now, what about that newer mic they released that's supposed to be like the fusion of the D12 and the D112?
It looks cool. I haven't tried one. But I used. Do you have I guess you must have SE microphones over there. There's a brand called the X1D, which is discontinued now, but that was my secret weapon for kick out mics for a long time. It was only 60 quid, I think it cost me, and just sounded amazing, completely amazing. In fact, the tip off I got from it was from a Nashville producer. I can't remember his name off the top of my head now. He's done loads of massive sort of country pop records. He always wears those orange glasses, like with orange lenses.
Interesting.
Can't remember what his name is. Anyway, he was the one that I kind of found that idea about, and I went and bought it, and it's ridiculous. But anyway, no, I haven't tried their new mic out, and I haven't tried a D12 if I'm completely honest. I'm kind of where I'm at.
Yeah. Have you talked on the podcast at all about how you do the all you need is drums? Like, what do you use for that gear wise?
No, I don't think I have. No.
Well, if there's time, I welcome you to talk about that.
Oh yeah, I'll talk it through. It'd be interesting to hear your take on it. So my kind of, I think I'm living in both camps because of the nature of what I do with remote work. Is not all of the producers I work with are as laid back about sounds as you are. You know, I'd love it if that was the case, but it's not. So, you know, I have kind of setups within setups. Basically, I'm covering all bases.
Yeah.
And I have a template that I use. So I run through Logic, and I have a template that I use, and all of the time, like the hi-hat mic is muted, my stereo overheads are muted, I've got quite a lot of muted microphones that I rarely ever listen to, other than to check that they still sound good.
But you record them because your clients will likely want them or might want them.
Exactly, and they're there on the isolated drums. You know, all of those have got. That's if you go look through the multi-tracks of them, they've got all of those mics there. So you could, you know, yes, okay, I might be playing "Let It Be" or whatever song it is, but you can turn that into a modern, you know, modern pop sound if you wanted to.
Yeah.
It's not just committed to 4 mics. So I basically got the D19 and the Coles in mono overhead at the top, and I switch between them depending on whether, if it's early, then it's Coles. If it's late 60s, it's the D19.
Okay.
And they're sort of...
Are the Coles is it a mono Coles or is it stereo?
Just mono.
Okay.
So it's mounted on the same stand, the D19 and the Coles, and I know that, you know, it shifts around depending on what pictures that you look at from Ringo recording, but they're basically just sort of chin height if you're stood up. They're actually quite low to the kit.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, which I've experimented with. I had them quite high at one point and I didn't like it, and I brought them lower and it got quite a bit more actual kit sound, and I enjoyed that a lot more.
Especially the D19. The D19, if I could bring it closer to the kit and still call it an overhead, I would, because it just very quickly stops having a lot of that fullness to it, and it just sounds thin and cymbally.
Yeah, and it's got a really nice punch on the kick and snare, and the toms, just on the drums in general. When you bring it closer into the kit, it's that sound. You know, it's Ringo's sound straight away. It's instantly recognizable. The sort of the sonic quality of that microphone, and it does give you a nice punch on the kick and snare that that the Coles does do, but the Coles has got kind of like a warmth over the top that kind of negates a little bit of that punch that the D19 has. I think anyway. So yeah, that's kind of how I do it, and then I've got other sort of unique bits that no, not unique, but the kind of speciality bits are I've got a small diaphragm condenser, like a pencil mic underneath the snare, whereas a lot of people would use like a 57 or something, whereas I'm doing that whole under snare thing, which is very crispy, very crispy. So I have the fader pulled down on the DAW to, you know, like 10%, if that, because otherwise it just gets way too much. But that's kind of a really nice thing. I like that a lot, and it's a nice way of controlling. You get the real, when you're doing a modern mix, you can get the real attack from the top snare top, but then you can dial in as much crispiness, you know, as much of the snare tone as you want from underneath, which I quite enjoy. And that's basically it. So unless I'm doing something late, in which case I will switch up the toms to be mic'd underneath, because I think that's quite important to get the sort of T-tailed sound. But other than that, I generally am doing kick out with the sort of large diaphragm condenser, angling down from 12 o'clock sort of towards the center of the kick, which gets that nice sort of warm, not very punchy kick sound, which I quite like. I'm not a huge fan of kick in, really. I like just that natural. I like to get a kick sound from the room mics and the kick out. That's kind of where my favorite kick sounds are coming from.
That's interesting. I haven't thought of that before.
Yeah, so you're getting like a bit of attack and a bit of body from the sort of 12 o'clock kick out mic, but then most of the general kick sound is coming from the rooms. That's kind of, I don't know, there's something about that. It's almost a chalky sound, whereas I don't like that. I'm not a fan of that kind of, how would I even describe it? Like a duh sound that you get inside the drum. That it's like a quite a modern pop kick sound that, you know, if you buy a sample pack, that's what the kick will often sound like. And I don't, just not a fan of that sound at all. It doesn't sound good on its own. It punches through in a mix, I suppose, for radio, but it's not a sound that I'm particularly fond of. I really like that sort of chalky, leathery kick sound that you get from a room mic, essentially, just enhanced slightly from that kick out mic.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of it. And so I'm using the rooms, got some stereo Reslo old BBC broadcast mics that I use for the room mics.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so generally the mix that I use on the isolated drums when you download the stereo or the mono mix will be one mono overhead, and then kick out and the rooms. And then depending on what era of Beatles it is, it will have the snare bottom dialed in too, and potentially some toms. And that's it. And I then blast it through a Fairchild plugin and the Abbey Road TG mastering thing, and do what John Lennon said and just crank the tops and crank the bottom and like up to full, and it suddenly just sounds like a Beatles drum kit. And I love it.
Wow.
Yeah. So I'm not doing an awful lot to it really. It's just I think a lot of it is down to the playing, you know, not to say that I'm, you know, it's all about me necessarily. It's all about playing it like Ringo played it. And that's the sound, you know, the baggy hi-hats and the sort of snappy snare drums and all that kind of stuff. I think a lot of it's down to that. I think that's the case. I mean, sure, you find it in your studio that you can get away with minimal miking when you're recording either yourself or another drummer because the internal kick balance is there. That's, you know,
right.
I think that having a lot of microphones is a tool to use when the drummer's not very good and you're likely to need to do a lot of editing or mixing to get a sound that you want. Whereas with minimal microphones, the sound's already there and you're capturing it in the way you can. Yeah, that's kind of how my mind thinks about it.
Yeah, it's that's one of the important underrated pieces of advice in audio is record good musicians.
Yeah, there you go.
You know, you might not think you're a very good engineer, and the problem might be who you're recording.
Yeah. I just think back to watching, you know, when I was learning about all this stuff years ago, watching videos and reading about different ways of doing things, and everything was about fixing. All of it was about fixing. Nothing was about making it sound good on the way in. It was all about, you know, so if your snare drum's not quite got the attack that you need, you're like, well, hold on. Why has it not got the right attack? Have you using the wrong snare drum? Is he not hitting it hard enough? Like,
yeah.
You know, why are we fixing this now? This should have been fixed before this happened.
Yeah. I think a lot of people at least in our era, have learned sort of back to front. And I don't know if that's how it always was. I'm sure everybody learns it different. But for me, I think I learned from, you know, I already talked about the kind of lots of mic position, but also just trying to learn what a compressor does. And, you know, I kind of learned that you shouldn't do that much on the way in, and you should leave yourself all these options, and you should get lots and lots of takes, and you should come back and make it sound better later and do all your compression and everything. You know, I don't actually think that that's completely a wrong way to learn. So now I do everything. I think a lot more about the drums in the room. Now I think a lot more about just putting a smaller amount of mics in the right places. And I compress on the way in, and I EQ on the way in, and I actually find myself doing today much less to my mixes than I used to do. I don't have to work as hard as I used to have to work to try to get a good sound. My sounds today sound better, quicker, with less effort than my sounds in the beginning did, with much more time and effort. But the thing is that I think, you know, as every engineer says, like, so it comes down to your ears. I think you have to learn what the hell a compressor sounds like. And that is such a hard thing to do. And I think only way you could do it, I mean, you can learn what a compressor does. You can learn what other people do with them. You can try them yourself. But you just have to do it so many times until you kind of hear what sounds overcompressed, what sounds undercompressed, and what sound you want right now. And what happens to sound good today with this drummer and this snare, you know? And but once those things are internalized and you've mixed a few hundred songs or whatever, then you can get those sounds pretty quickly because you know what you're listening for and what you're aiming for. And so in a lot of ways, I guess I'm saying like as much as the excesses of modern recording and like leaving yourself all this potential and options is, I don't think it's where everybody, it seems like everybody lands at a much simpler place when you get good at it. But I wonder if you need to maybe go through that period of time, unless you were just so happen to be able to be trained by somebody who could take you there straight away. I just wonder if you kind of need your time where you're just playing with too many tracks, with too many compressors and too many EQs to learn the things so that later you can get there quicker and simpler.
I think that's definitely something that producers now have available to them with plugins. You know, there would have been a time where, you know, an upcoming producer had a tape machine and that was all that they had.
Yeah.
Whereas now we have the option to put, you know, I think back to some of the mixes I did years ago, and I dread to think how many plugins are on every channel, and all because, you know, I saw this one particular way of doing something. Then this guy put these plugins on that snare, so I have to, you know, I'll emulate that. And you know, now very similar to you. I mean, there's hardly anything going on. It sounds kind of nice on the way in. There's maybe a bit of a tweak here and there, but yeah, you do need to. I think you do need that experience. My drum teacher used to say to me about your ability on the drums is you need to have the ability of a Ferrari, but doesn't necessarily mean you need to drive around at 100 miles an hour. You can just, you know, you can nip to the shops in your Ferrari, or, you know, or like, you know, you basically have a Ferrari under the bonnet, but you can look like a standard hatchback car if you want to.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a nice way, you know, when I think that's kind of how I think of my jazz training in terms of drums is, you know, I had my moment of improvising and sort of doing my thing and making it overplaying and all that kind of stuff. And now I've come full circle back to, I don't really feel, I don't have any need to do that anymore. I just want to play what works. And it's getting rid of that ego. But I suppose in music production, it's not necessarily about ego. Maybe it is. Maybe it's about covering up your lack of confidence in your ability by thinking that you need to do lots of things to things. And then after a while you go, actually, I can make this sound pretty good by just miking it right and pulling the fader up and, you know, putting this amount of compression on the way in and EQing this little bit here and off we go.
Yeah. I think my personality is also such that I feel that I'm generally fairly driven and I don't want to be lazy. And so I think from a starting out position, you go like, okay, the pros, they have all this gear and all of this technology, and that's how you'll do it, is by using all of it. And so I don't want to be lazy. I'm going to spend 4 times as long to mix this song as somebody else might, because that's, you know, the hard work that needs to be put in. And then it's just been challenging as I recently read Al Schmidt's book, and he talked about how, you know, they didn't have EQ when he started. So even to this day, he almost never uses EQ. His like main thing is he's like, well, I'll use a Pultec and add one high, go to the one setting on high end and maybe boost it one on the lows, you know, and that's like what he'll use for EQ. But he gets all of his great sounds by just using the right microphones in the right place.
I love that, and it reminds me of another interesting thing about kind of older gear is how delicate, or not. You know, just talked about the Beatles drums. You know, cranking the high end and cranking the low end, literally up to full. You could do that on that old stuff. You can take a Pultec, and yeah, you can tickle it a little bit, but you can crank a Pultec up to the max, and it will still sound like an acceptable recording. Whereas you take a modern EQ. and crank it to the max, and it will sound horrendous. So there was the sort of what's the expression I'm looking for? Like the margin of error, that's it, was sort of a bit greater with some of that gear because it was a bit more forgiving. Whereas now the gear that we're using is so surgical at times that it's not very forgiving at all. If you can really make a hatchet job of something if you're not careful with the way that you do things. And I think that doesn't make for confidence in the studio, really. Whereas when you know you can have a Pultec and just like, oh, I'll turn that massive knob quite a bit, and it still sounds okay, then that kind of gives you a bit more flexibility. It's just kind of interesting to hear that.
I heard at one point somebody said a rule they were told was if you're doing more than 6 decibels of a boost or cut, then you're probably not spending enough time with your mic, getting the right miking position.
Interesting.
And at times I do find myself doing more than a booster cut of 6 decibels, but I have that boundary in my head to where if I get past 6, I go, wait, do I really need this much EQ? And sometimes you do. But generally, that's been a challenge for me to kind of try to get closer and closer to just getting it right off the bat instead of needing to rely on your EQs later to create the sound for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I hear that. It's kind of a little warning light that, something was done wrong on the front end. Maybe you didn't mic it right, so you do have to fix it later because you have made an error, or didn't think about the particular sound that instrument's going to have in that particular point in the song or whatever. But it's just that little thing. Like next time, I'll probably need to think about this. No, I hear what you're saying, and I haven't really thought about it in that way, but I have that same feeling. Something I'm quite interested for you to talk about again is this. This is the tom miking technique that you read in Al Schmidt's book that you mentioned, because I want to hear it again. I genuinely do, but I know that the listeners will want to hear it because it's a cool little idea.
Well, later I'll have to send you the recording.
Please do.
Yeah. I would point people to the track, but it's not done yet, and I don't know when it'll be out. But so I didn't read about this in Al Schmidt's book, but some of the principles I did. So one thing I read in Al Schmidt's book is he always uses mics in Omni. And his position on it is that microphones are by nature Omni, and that if they're not, it's because you've done something to the capsule to create cardio 8 or figure of 8, etc. So you're changing, that uses, I'm not going to remember, but I think you're using phase cancellation to create that. Or something, however they're doing it, those scientists. But in the meantime, the Omni is the more like pure form of what that capsule does left to its own. And so anyhow, that challenged me to throw all of my condensers into Omni mode, and I've just been living there for a while now. But the Tom thing I did recently is just essentially inspired back to what I was saying before, like, I'm using the same mics on every session, and I'm always using the studio kit. Like, no band wants to bring in their own kit when there's we have a Ludwig here. It's a nice sounding kit, so nobody wants to bring in drums, and I don't want to either. I don't want to move them. And so I'm using the same kit in the same room with the same mics and the same preamp every single time. So you got to get creative or you're just going to be bored and lose all of your interest in doing this, So my creativity has come in outside of the box miking techniques as of late. And so the thing we're specifically talking about right now was an idea I had like 2 weeks ago. And it started with, I just thought, maybe this time I'll use condensers on the tom mics instead of dynamic mics like I probably normally would. And so I set up that, and then I looked at it and I set up a mono D19 as an overhead. And then I looked at that and I went, those are Omni condenser mics placed on opposite ends of the kit. Like, they're gonna kind of be like overheads if you think about it. They're gonna pick up a lot of the same thing overheads would. Different perspective, but same. You're gonna get lots of cymbals and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And typically I've always gone in and strip silenced out my toms so that they only pop out when there's actual tom hit, and I've cut out all that bleed.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought, what if I just make it good bleed and make this usable? And so I realized that the floor tom mic is essentially in the same position it would be for Glenn Johns overheads.
Yeah.
So this is almost just a modified Glenn Johns in a sense. So the D19 is above the snare, kind of where you'd put it for a Glenn Johns. And I was using Sony C38Bs on the toms. So floor tom, just like Glenn Johns, by the floor tom, but pointed vertically, pointed towards the snare. And then I just went ahead and moved back the rack tom mic and measured it to the snare so that both of them were equidistant to the snare, kind of like a lot of people do with overheads. And I'm like, wait a minute, these are overheads. They're just not over. And so I started thinking about it that way, and then just trying to do what I might do to try to make overheads sound good. And instead of only optimize for toms, optimize for the kit. And what I found was like these, it essentially becomes both overhead and tom mics at the same time. It's close enough to the toms to get some of the low end that you would use a direct mic for, but it's far enough back to get a picture of the kit that can be used as stereo overheads if you want that. And so other than that, I mean, that was I use a Unidyne 3 for the snare most of the time. And then just the D112 on the kick. So that was pretty standard. And then the one other weird thing that I do now all the time is I'll put my U87 in figure of 8 back into as a room mic. And initially I did that from hearing that the Beatles always had like a U48 and figure of 8 in the room for the vocals. And so I'm like, okay, cool, I'll get that sound of having that, figure 8 mic up. And then one day it occurred to me that I could use it as a mid-side mic. And when you mid-side encode it, it turns out that the mono information that you're getting from the kit already, especially that mono overhead, it winds up giving you a stereo room mic for the price of one microphone. And it's not completely accurate to how mid-side should be. You should have the mono mic in, directly next to the room mic with the capsules coincident. But it turns out it works. It sounds like a stereo room to me. And so anyway, that's my new weird miking technique.
I love it. I think I mentioned yesterday that it's I was having a conversation with Neil Innes, who I've spoken to on this podcast. He has a nice studio here in Leeds, and he explained, I don't think he didn't come up with this, but he explained about microphones being like cameras, and they photograph a particular thing. And I love that you've kind of naturally moved towards, obviously you're restricted because of the restrictions that you've got on your desk, the number of channels that you've got. So you've kind of naturally gravitated towards having to be creative with what that photograph looks like, that sonic photograph looks like, and it almost feels like it was a matter of time before you came up with something like this, because you're like, oh, hold on, I've only got 4 channels and I want to pick up the whole kit, and I'm using this mic, and actually if I put it here I can pick this up and that up, and it all feels completely like, oh, well, of course you were going to get there. I love it. I love the ingenuity in that, and like that you can continually. It's inspiring to me to want to try some new stuff out, because I generally don't move things. I think I moved from like a sort of wide stereo overhead mic technique to an X and Y technique, and I moved from a sort of spread out room technique to a Blumline technique in the room, and that's as mad as I've got in the last few months.
Well, also, I mean, you're first and foremost, when you're working with your clients, your art is the drums themselves, and so it makes sense. When I don't get to play the drums, I'm gonna, I have to find my spot to put my mark and have some art in the whole thing, and so it would make sense. It would be more kind of based on what I'm doing, having to do that. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, and you're having to deal with the with the aftermath of it too. So
Exactly.
you know what you're going to have to do mix wise to sort of get the sound that you're after. Whereas I can't be like, surprise, I've only used 2 mics. Off you go.
Yeah, I think that kind of just sparked another thought in me, which is just, I think it's so helpful for engineers of all kinds to spend some time mixing and get a sense of like what happens to your tracks later. I think luckily, I mean, for most people today, that's just the reality that you're probably gonna have to at least start that way. But I think mixing has taught me a lot about tracking, because when you're tracking, you get some cool idea and you think it's going to be amazing. But when you get it into a mix, you realize the challenges with what you've done.
Yes.
And so I think having a constant, learning requires a feedback loop of getting, feedback from the things that you've tried. And so when you're the one mixing it, you learn some things, and you learn some things about, hey, that might sound really cool when you just hear drums. But once the whole track is there, it's actually makes the drums very hard to hear. And anyway, I just think that's a helpful thing for somebody when trying to learn tracking, is like, well, learn mixing too.
I think that's absolutely right, and it makes it a little bit more obvious why you make certain choices and why you put microphones in certain places, and how important kit balance is. This is just as a drummer, or even with every instrument. Like, why do we often DI the bass? It's because bass is difficult to deal with in a like, if it spills in a live performance setting, and it's easier to control in a mix. And it makes everything, all of those explanations become obvious when when you're having to deal with that yourself. Whereas if you have no idea, you just know that your bass sounds great through an amp, or your kick sounds great when you put loads of low end on it and loads of a top in a very specific place, and it's got like this huge big kick sound. Well, you're not going to have to mix that and
Right.
make it balance with the bass and not take up the whole track with like excessive low end.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important, and it's something I sort of guess I've taken for granted myself, that I do mix, and I hadn't really thought that that's informing my my choices when I'm tracking. Of course it is, but it hadn't really crossed my mind. I think you're absolutely right. Having a little bit of knowledge in all areas of a studio is probably quite important.
Yeah, and bringing it back to, we talked about songwriting earlier. That's, even if you're not the one writing the song, knowing about songwriting is a helpful tool to have. As a producer, I think it's important that you can recognize a good song or not. But it's also good if you know the craft of songwriting to, even when it comes to drums, to do things that enhance the song or don't steal from the song, that make it better. All of your decision, everything affects everything you do in a certain sense of the word. And so I think it's not enough to just delve into the technical and have a great understanding of what everything does on a scientific level. I think you do need to know that, but really, like, you need to know it all. And if you have a knowledge of what makes for a good song, that affects choices you make with a guitar amplifier.
Yes. It absolutely does. And I think this is kind of, I was almost hoping that we'd come back to this place, because we ended this conversation yesterday, the one that didn't get recorded, in a really, really lovely place, which is kind of where we're at now, where you've got this nice balance. But we talked about songwriting and how having somebody who knows an excessive amount about songwriting and harmony and all of the technical details of songwriting. Then you've got somebody like you who knows a lot more. Yes, okay, you know some of that stuff, but you also know what feels right, and you know what makes a great song instinctively through your experience, as opposed to your education. And that marriage is really, really works well. And in terms of recording, kind of a nice observation is that in the sort of 60s and 50s and through to the 70s, there was this progression of recording techniques where, you know, you take a trad jazz band in the UK, and I can't remember which book I was reading this in. I couldn't remember yesterday either, but it will come to me at some stage. I can picture the book cover. Anyway, so they were recording this trad jazz band, and they put, you know, one microphone in front of the whole band, and that's how they recorded that band as an entity. And the band leaders insisted on it. You know, you were not allowed to close mic anything. Why would you? The band sounds like a band, and you only need one microphone. That's it.
Wow.
And that's kind of like early 60s, late 50s. And then you kind of get the Beatles coming into Abbey Road. Obviously, they weren't pioneering this. This is just how they did it. But like kit mics would be like one overhead, one snare, one kick even. And then, you know, everything was very simple, and then it progressed. And you can see that progression really clearly through the Beatles, which is one of the reasons that they're talked about so much and it's so well documented. And then recording got more and more advanced. And then it kind of got to the Pro Tools era, and the era that we have both grown up in, where it's been an era of excess. You know, we've had every option available to us. We can mic up every single drum if we want to, and more. And we have enough channels on the desk to do whatever we want with. We've got enough plugins available to us to put as many compressors where we want to without having to buy a single one of them.
Yeah.
And I think what's really interesting observation is the fact that we're having this conversation now is down to the fact that we've grown up in this era of excess, which was a natural progression from the way that recording went from the sort of 50s right through to the current day. And we're now having to lose all of that, or, you know, try and forget some of that to bring it back round to like, okay, well, what's this about? You know, we don't need to mic every tom up. We can get that great sound that they got back in the 60s by using 4 mics. And you know, I really enjoy the fact that that's where we're currently at. You know, that there are people like us who are sort of, you know, young engineers in the world now who are realizing that, and that's the reason that we're having this conversation on a podcast about 60s recording, talking about modern. You know, your records sound modern. You know, they've got a vintage.
How dare you?
But they've got got a vintage songwriter feel to them. But you know, they sound like modern records. They you know what I mean. They stand up on a Spotify playlist, and that you don't go, oh, this was made in the 60s, but it was made with techniques that. Thank you so much for doing this again. This is night 2 that we've spent with each other. Appreciate it. Podcast exists, and why these conversations are important, because there is so many options available to young engineers these days, and it's frightening how many options. I think that starting small, or even ending up small like you have, and is kind of a nice way to be, and it's a nice place to end up in. And when you do expand, you're expanding one at a time for a reason. You know, like you said, like every mic you add is added for a reason, and you know what that's going to contribute. It's not just because we put 20 mics on the kit every time.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a lot. It is very hard to give up all those options that you have, but I do think it's a really valuable exercise. And if there's anybody out there who's afraid to give it up, I feel like the thing for me that works, just the way I'm geared, is to get really into something. For me, for a while, it was the AKG BX20 when it came to reverb.
Okay.
That I got really into that. I used it on everything all the time. But I've switched now to the Capital Chambers, again, UAD. And so every one of my songs, everything that I put out and everything that I produce for other people uses the Capital Chambers almost exclusively. That is the reverb. There's so many options in it. Unless it's like an 80s sounding throwback song, in which case it's the RMX. But like, get into some cool piece of vintage gear, spend $300 to buy the UAD plug or whatever, so that it kind of hurts enough that you feel like you got to use it.
Yeah.
You know,
I love that.
Or buy some one cool microphone. I think it's such, it's a tangent, but for the longest time, I did not have a stereo pair of microphones here at the studio, and mostly because for most overdubs sessions I was doing, it wasn't really necessary, and it's a lot of money. And I had in my head that, I should have a pair of KM184s. And so I'm looking at, $2,000 maybe or something.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, that's a lot of money. And here's what I realized. It took me a long time to get here, but I realized I was not inspired to buy a pair of KM184s. I've used them in a lot of studios and everybody uses them. And I realized I'm just bored by the idea of the KM184, even though it's a great microphone and it's being used for a reason. And so I was poking around on Reverb and I found the Sony C38Bs, and I found, figured out that they were actually a really cool mic at one point in time, but are just less popular or known now. And I was able to find them around $600.
Wow.
And so I bought two, one from Japan and one from, I don't know, somewhere else, around $600. So it was cheaper than KM184s, which is great. But I found myself getting obsessed with this mic and its look and its history once I learned about it. And that was that inspiration was what was able to get me to buy it. And then now I have these, and now that's what I'm going to use. But if you can, we don't have the ability, most of us, to just like, well, I'm just not going to record with Pro Tools. I'm going to record on a 4-track tape machine. I mean, maybe you can do that, but if you can buy some one piece of cool gear and then just get obsessed with it for a while and overuse it, might be a way to help somebody embrace some limitations and realize that there's a million things you can do with that one piece of gear. I don't know.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think that goes hand in hand with kind of what I was saying about having so many options. You can buy, 1176. The 1176 I talked about at the beginning of this episode, that's what, 500 quid. That's not that much money in the grand scheme of things. I know it's quite a bit of money, but it's not tons and tons. You could conceivably buy a couple of those and, and that'd be that. And it'd just be part of the thing that you have. Whereas actually, if you've spent £2,000 or $2,000 or whatever on a significant thing, or made a significant investment, and you learn how that microphone sounds, or that piece of outboard sounds, or that desk sounds, you become intimately aware of all the nuances within it, and that informs all of your knowledge about other microphones as well, even microphones that you don't own or outboard that you don't own, because you've got a comparison to make. Whereas if you're looking at a plugin list and you're looking at 20 different compressors and you're using a different one every single time because you can, how are you going to learn anything? How are you going to? Yeah. There's no comparison there because you don't know any of them intimately. No, I have nothing against plugins at all.
Right.
I should say that, but I think that they're too cheap. Wave's selling them for $29 every 2 seconds.
Right. I know. I wish
we're
they
all
didn't
guilty
do
of
that.
it.
I think Waves kind of started seeming a lot less cool when there was a sale every 5 seconds. It felt a lot less important.
Yeah, and the price tag that they put on it is just not believable.
Right.
Whereas if you spent $300 on a plugin, like you say, you're gonna damn well find some users for it. Yeah, exactly. And I love that. And I think that we should be doing more of that. We should be investing in higher quality, single or smaller investments, and really learning how to use those things rather than living in this sort of world of excess where we can buy this clone and that clone and just because it's cheap and I want my studio to have that piece of looking gear in the rack.
And in the meantime, if you can't afford it, get the thing you can afford and figure out how to make that thing sound good, and you'll have learned a valuable lesson.
Absolutely. I agree with that too. That's great advice. Okay, there we have it. Part 2 of my conversation with Ryan Poole. I really hope that you enjoyed that and enjoyed a little break away from the relative intensity of the Ted Fletcher lectures, which we will be returning to next week. if you did vote for Nite Tides in the sort of Nashville radio voting thing that happened, my mind is in 1,000 different places, so I can't remember the exact name of what it was. But Ryan messaged me, and they managed to get through on a wild card, and he's very happy. So the next round of voting will be around now. So if you do happen to visit the Nite Tides Instagram page, Ryan's got a really cool approach to social media, so I do actually recommend you go and check out the Nite Tides Instagram page. It's pretty funny. And if you're in the US and would like to support the band, please do so, and help them out in this Battle of the Bands style radio competition. It's really nice that this community exists in order to help with things like that. Okay, so as I said, next week we're returning to the Ted Fletcher lectures, and I've also conducted numerous interviews in this interim period. So I've got some quite exciting guests coming up over the next few weeks, once the next section of lectures is finished. So yes, that just leaves me to say, if you would like to rate the podcast, as I said earlier, on Spotify or iTunes or wherever you're listening to this podcast, that would be much appreciated. You can contact me through my website, which is allyouneedisdrums.com. You can also visit that website and find out about the free isolated drums that I give away, and drum sessions, and all the kind of other bits and bobs that I do. Also, a big thank you to Joe Kane for the intro and outro music, to Adam Mallet for the artwork he designs, and to Rory Hancock for constructing the podcast and uploading it and doing all of that jazz. Most importantly, thank you to you for listening, and I will be back next week. Goodbye.